The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome on today's session, which is all about uncovering examiners' comments for your audit and assurance exam. You all know me as Tahir Kapasi, and I am the education manager for ACCA in the Middle East. I'm also an ACCA member, so I've actually sat and passed this very exam a couple of years ago. And when I did my audit exam, it used to be hugely different from what it is today and the way it has been done. Obviously, the main difference being I did it on a piece of paper, so I wrote my entire exam with an achy palm and aching fingers right after I finished my examination. You guys are lucky to have your exams on a computer-based system where it's a lot more high-tech, it's a lot more advanced, and it's actually complementing what the employers are asking for this day and age. Today's session, we will be looking at not just the examiner's comment, and again, mind you, a caveat for everybody attending. I mean, when we say examiner's comments, I'm not here, or I'm not going to be reading out the examiner's comments word for word for you. What my job here on this session, or what I aim to do, get out of this session, is basically intrigue your interest enough by giving you a bit of insight, few highlights, and basically read between the lines for you some of the key themes, key things that the examiner for audit and insurance has said in some of their recent reports, and perhaps be able to guide you towards going in and reading the entire report yourselves. Before we proceed with today's session, just a few housekeeping rules. So it's going to be an hour, perhaps maybe a little bit longer, a wee bit, depending on how many questions we keep getting, but probably an hour session. The slides will obviously move as I present and speak to you. If you do not hear my voice in between, or if you find that the slides are not moving, a good idea would be for you to log out and log back into the system, and hopefully that should do the job for you. We've got a dedicated Q&A session at the end, towards the end of this section. So feel free to keep, sort of throwing in your questions using the questions panel on the top left of your screen. I will do all my best to, sort of attempt all your questions and, give you the answers as I possibly can in the best possible way. So without further ado, let's start cracking on with today's session. Oops, and I think my slides are not moving. Yep, they are now. So what are we going to be covering in today's session? So we will be basically looking at, familiarizing with the audit and insurance exam. We're already in the end of, so we're towards the end of July. It's the standard exam entry deadline day. I would imagine for those of you that are already sitting the audit and insurance exam in September this year, this shouldn't be an area that you're not familiar with. I would imagine you'd probably around the finishing off your learning stages and getting into your revision stages, but still it'll be just good for all the others attending the call, the webinar, that have not really started exploring and thinking about audit insurance yet. We will then move on to looking at the 3 Ps that we've come up with, which are plan, prepare, and pass, that can help you, in terms of giving your strategy or your structure around tackling the audit insurance exam. We will then move to, a few tips on how you can get started for those that have, not considered the audit exam for this exam sitting and are thinking about giving the audit for, December or any subsequent future exam sessions. What should you expect? Basically, we'll look at some of the commonly examined topics that you can expect to see when you sit the audit exams. We will then dive into the examiner's comments, which are the biggest chunk of our session this afternoon, and we will wrap up by looking into a couple of hints and tips around how you can be successful with your with passing your audit and assurance exam, as well as pick up any specific questions that you might have around your examination. So this is an overview of your entire audit and assurance subject, and basically what is covered within the actual exam itself. So your audit and assurance basically will help you understand the knowledge as well as the application that goes into an audit engagement. So if you look at the overview and the diagram here, this really gives you a holistic view of basically how things work right from the time when an audit engagement is accepted by a firm moving on to, doing some research and internal studies around the entity, its environment, assessing the kind of risk and material misstatements, etc., then going into the effective control. So in a sense, if you look at the diagram, these are all, one after the other, the stages of an audit process, and basically, moving right from accepting the audit engagement, going all the way down to, final review, and then sort of submitting the auditor's report. So all of these key stages are involved within the audit and assurance as a overall engagement. Now, let's look at the exam structure really quickly. So basically two main sections. Section A worth 30 marks. It consists of 3 OT cases. Each case will have 5 objective test questions worth 2 marks each, which means 10 marks per objective case question. Now, what are objective test questions? Some of you might already be familiar with these. These are, your short, really dynamic type questions where, it involves things like fill in the blank, drag and drop, multiple choice, MCQs, and various different, styles of questions. They're always going to be based on a typical short scenario. Each of these scenarios would usually be based on 1 or 2, audit concepts, and then you'd have 5 relevant relating questions to answer. Your section B being the biggest chunk of the actual exam, which consists of about 70 marks, will be based on 3 scenario-based questions with 2 or more, there could be multiple requirements. All of the questions are compulsory, by the way. Just a few quick tips on how you could, sort of navigate through your objective test questions effectively. So for your objective test questions, you've got to always have a very clear and, very straightforward strategy. You always read each question very carefully. You think before you answering, because it's quite important. Ideally, your objective test questions will cover your entire syllabus area. So firstly, you're going to have to be quite updated with every part or every aspect of the syllabus, and you're going to have to be very much hands-on with your objective test questions. So you've got to think before you logically think before you answer. If you are not very sure of your answer, you go by the method of eliminating the incorrect answer. So you look for the obvious ones, which definitely are a no-go, and you think, well, this can definitely not be the right answer, and you start eliminating those options from your choices. And most importantly, with your objective test questions, it's either a win or a lose. So there's no midway there. And when you're in a situation like this, the best strategy is to be able to answer all questions, even if you're not sure about the answer. You'd best be able to give some form of an answer rather than skipping completely and not answering, because what if it's a guess, and what if you get the kind of the answer correct? So answer all your questions regardless of how confident you feel about them on the objective testing. For your section B type questions, the key is basically to be able to read the requirement gaps carefully and really understand what you've been asked for. Now, audit and assurance being a very sort of birdy exam, huge on theories, huge on analysis. You've got to type in a lot of things. Requirements sometimes are mostly partly part requirements. There are 2 requirements in one single requirement, so it becomes more and more effective. The use of the word and, wherever you see the word and in your requirement, it naturally should stand out to you, and it should tell you that, hold on a minute, this question is not asking me for one thing. There are basically 2 different things that the question is asking me to do. Very common with audit and assurance exams. So you'll get questions like describe and explain, or identify and sort of analyze, etc. So the emphasis on the word and should be quite important, and everywhere you see that word and in your requirement, you need to automatically understand that this is a multi sort of requirement. It's got multiple questions in one requirement. The next point on answering a section B question successfully is to be able to draw on the scenario and plan the points that you need to make. So always have a plan. So the ideal strategy is basically start with reading the requirement first. Once you've read the requirement, you will know exactly what sort of data or what sort of information are you looking for when you read the entire scenario or the entire case. A lot of times, students, what they end up doing is they read the entire scenario first and then go and read the requirement, and they find out, oh, hang on a minute, this is what the requirement is. So now I've got to go and find out all the relevant information relating to this, and that will end up, you will basically end up spending a lot of time, valuable time in your exam. So always start with reading the requirement first, and then start plotting the scenario. Jot down, key points that you want to be making in terms of planning your answers. Use concise headings. Again, it's very, very important for your audit exams. Tables, the use of tables, the use of headings, I cannot emphasize how important they are. It gives your answers structure, it gives your answers some sort of presentation, and it makes the life of a marker quite easy. So imagine the marker just got to go tick, 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 tick. You get half a mark, 1 mark, half a mark, 1 mark, and it makes your life and the marker's life quite easy. Describe how the procedures should be performed. It's very important, for you to be able to describe the audit procedures. Now, a lot of times we end up, so the examiners have also mentioned that students end up basically just giving audit procedures even if they're not relevant. So you've got to be able to relate your answers to the scenario, and you've got to be able to sort of make sense of your answers, and just basically listing down the audit procedures will not help you get that kind of marks. So it's quite crucial in being able to understand how you answer section B type questions, because they're the longer form. It's the biggest chunk of your examination, and these questions will basically really help you understand, and getting the answers correct will help you score better marks in your exams. Let's move on now. So we will now look at how you start planning your audit exam, and I'll go through this section fairly quickly, because I would imagine a lot of you would have already gone through some of these. But when you're looking in your planning stages, you should ideally begin with getting to know your exam first. Once you've known your exam, and how does that happen? That happens by looking at the specimen exams, looking at the past exam papers, looking at the syllabus and study guide, the document that is specifically available for you. That's how you start familiarizing with what the exams are, what the learning outcomes are, what are the basic different sections of the exams, which sections are important, etc. Your study and syllabus guide will give you all of that information. Next thing is you find support for yourself. So you find yourself a appropriate learning partner, or a tuition provider, or a tutor that will really help you tackle this exam and really help you pass this exam successfully. You're advised to use only approved ACCA approved content. So whilst there's a lot of content out there, we appreciate that our approved content providers put in a lot of effort to put things together. It is approved by ACCA, which means it has the assurance of the quality and the standard, and we know for sure that the material that our approved content providers have produced sufficiently covers the learning outcomes that we expect a student to cover while studying for that subject. Draw up a study plan, very important. You have to have a plan. If you don't have a plan, you're basically planning to fail. So you have to have a plan, make yourself a study plan, and then start following it religiously. And finally, you work on your CBE skills. We all know that these exams have no longer been ancient. We don't write on a piece of paper anymore. Our exams have all gone on a computer-based platform, and therefore, in order for you to be more efficient and more effective with being able to sort of type your exams, it's very important, and it's absolutely crucial for you to be able to work on your computer-based skills. So these are things like your word processing skills, or your spreadsheet skills. With respect to your audit and assurance exam, your word processing skills have to be really sharp, because a lot of your answers that you would be typing or constructing in the actual exam will all be on a word processing unit. On the preparation phase, it's absolutely important for you to be able to sort of gain the knowledge in your learning phase. Your preparation should ideally be split into 3 different parts. First part being your learning phase, where you take in all the knowledge, you work with an expert tutor, you take guidance, and you sort of seep in everything that your tutors and your textbooks and everything that are telling you. So you update yourself with the technical knowledge, the essential knowledge, and then you move on to the revision phase, where you basically learn how to apply that relevant knowledge to a given scenario. And in your revision phase, it should all be about, practice, practice, practice. So practice as many exam standard questions as you possibly can. Get your tutors to mark your practice questions. So use the ACCA's constructed response workspace, which is another brilliant resource basically that's available on ACCA website. You all should know as ACCA students that we have a host of resources available for you on ACCA's website, and I cannot stress the importance of students going in and using those resources, because we've invested into building those resources just for your own benefit. So the things like constructed response workspace, CBE practice platform, these are all developed for you and your own benefit. So go in, make the most of these resources. They're quite essential. They're all available to all our ACCA students for free. Make use of most of them. In your past stage, basically this is all about sitting before, just before you sit your exam, a week or two before your exam, you should be completely up to date with your knowledge. You should have practiced enough questions, and then you start looking at doing mock exams. Ideally, try and take at least a minimum of 2 mock exams or practice tests before you sit for an actual exam, because your mock exams are a reflection of how you will perform on your actual exam day, and they help building up with your confidence. You should know that there are no knowledge gaps, that you're completely on the ball with all your different knowledge subjects, particularly now because your exams have become computer-based exams, and therefore cherry picking or spotting topics that might be coming in for an exam are a lot lesser. And you should avoid doing that, because you've got to be abreast with all your subject area. Ensure that you are able to manage time. And how will you look at time management? How will you know how much time it takes you to basically answer a 10-mark requirement or a 20-mark scenario question, etc.? That's only going to be by practicing. If you practice and if you solve mock exams, if you do question practicing under time and exam conditions, that's how you will start getting better and better at managing time. One of the comments by the examiner on the audit and insurance exam is also that a lot of students manage their time quite poorly on this exam. It's because you tend to either get carried away and you tend to write a lot or type a lot, and you end up spending and wasting a lot of time, or you've not managed your time. You've spent a lot of time somewhere else, and then you've really cramped for time, and you've condensed your answers and really listed and bullet pointed them, etc., towards the end. And most importantly, before your exam, you just basically relax, sit, you feel confident, because if you've followed all these steps, you're a lot more confident, you're a lot more prepared for the exam. You go and sit for your exam and you pass with flying colors. Okay, so let's quickly look at a few points on how you can get yourself started. I know taking that first step could be slightly challenging for some people. You've got to really understand how we can take the first steps. So where am I heading in the right direction? So you always start with reviewing the syllabus, the study guides, as well as the the examinable documents. It's a good way for you to be able to familiarize how the exam is going to be looking. What are the type of questions that I can get asked. Scan the specimen exam, again a good place to start off with. Review the examining team guidance. So there's a dedicated section on ACCA's website which says the examining team guidance. It's got brilliant videos in there. It's got lots of tips for you. It's got the examiner's articles and comments also in there. You review the key themes from those examiner reports. Basically, examiner reports are a summary of how students in the past have performed on their actual exams, and they help. The idea of us producing those examiner reports are basically to ensure any students that are resitting the audit exam, or any students that are sitting the exam for the first time, get a view of where students commonly make mistakes, what are the things that they should be focusing on or not, etc. So please do make the most of these reports that are available to you. Look at the study support videos, and also look at the exam technique and syllabus update articles that are available on ACCA's website. So these are the key stages where you can start. You can start when you're preparing an exam. For an exam, you can get yourself started by following some of these key steps. Now, what should you expect on an audit and assurance exam? A caveat before we start looking into this topic: this is not a sort of indication on what sort of subjects you should ideally focus on. I'm just giving you an idea of what are the commonly examined, sort of examined topics here. As with all the exams, the full syllabus is examinable, and you must by all means, cover the entire syllabus. However, there are some topics that are very regularly and highly examinable, in the audit and insurance exams, and these basically are things like your professional ethics and your corporate governance. So ideally your audit framework. Now this area of the syllabus basically requires understanding of different functions of the audit, and the understanding of how corporate governance and professional ethics all work sort of together. So auditing has a huge, there's a huge role of corporate governance and professional ethics that plays on an auditor's part. So you should be able to understand how these two sort of mix up. Audit planning is another very sort of key area, and there's huge focus around how audit planning is done. What are the areas that you need to take care of when you're planning an audit? How much control, how much tests, what are the details that you need to go into? Again, assessing the type of audit risk, and basically analyzing what sort of risks are associated, whether certain risks are material or not. Materiality is a huge concept again within auditing. For you to be able, for auditors to be able to make those decisions, make those choices, calculating materiality is also quite significant. So audit risk also tends to be a highly examinable area. Internal controls, again, very important area. And internal controls, basically, examiners have said that is an area where students generally find themselves a bit challenged because of the lack of that practical experience, of the lack of the the practical knowledge. Internal control, again, is a very important area. It thinks about how different controls are in place to ensure that certain audit processes are happening specifically, depending on the type of organization. Internal controls play a key area, and having an understanding of internal controls and looking at basically things in your surrounding. Why is something like this? Why is there a a lock on this door? Why is there a system where you have to enter a password before you get a document? These are all a part of internal control. And basically, when you start looking at things around yourself, you start looking at, why do I have to put my thumb, if you're employed, why do you have to put your thumb to a machine that lets you into a door? It's all a part of internal controls, and that's how you'll basically start analyzing and understanding why internal controls are in place. Audit procedures, audit review and reporting also tend to be extremely sort of important sections of the exam. There's a lot that the examiner asks. Mostly, students find that there is a question on audit reporting as well as audit review in your examination. So this is another very key topic for, this is another key area that students should ideally be focusing on. Generally, examiners don't ask you to really write an audit report or review an existing. They'll basically give you a part of the audit report, asking you to identify if this is appropriate, or if there is a if there is a need for a statement of emphasis to be put in, etc. So those are the kind of questions that you can expect to get around this particular area of the audit exam. So like I said, these are just a few lists of key exam or highly examinable areas in the audit and assurance exam. Pretty much the entire syllabus is sort of examinable, so you should avoid any cherry picking when it comes to selecting when it comes to studying for your audit and assurance exams. Now we come to the highlight of the day, and we come to the main area, which is the examiner's comments. Now, what are the examiner's comments? What are the examiner's reports? And how are they basically going to help you? Like I've already mentioned in the beginning, that examiner's reports are basically analysis of how students have previously performed on exams. What the examiners tend to do is they basically, they don't go by questions, the exact questions, but they pick up questions, a few selected questions from the same area. So for example, if in March 20 this year there was a question on audit reporting in section B, then the examiner will not pick up exactly same question, but they'll pick up a question on audit reporting, and similar question. They'll try and give a fundamental response in helping students understand where students mostly made a mistake, etc. So your examiner's reports are extremely important. I'm not going to be reading out these reports word for word for you. What I'm going to be doing in the session today is basically help you read between the lines, help you understand, give you some really key themes, some key points from what the examiners have identified in students during their previous exam sessions and their performances, and perhaps be able to intrigue your interest in that area where you can really go in and you can really read through the detailed reports yourself and learn a lot about how you should be tackling these exams going forward. So let's look at the general comments. These are the generic comments. Every exam, the examiner gives students a set of generic comments where they'll be asking students a certain number of things, and based on the student's performance and the way they've answered the question, they come up with some feedback saying, well, this is where commonly students go wrong. These are things where students need to pay a little bit attention. So the first of these area is obviously lack of accounting knowledge. So the examiner has identified that students have a fundamental lack of knowledge of the accounting standards, and I'm not saying, if you look at auditing as a subject, what is the crux of the of auditing? How do you think auditing is basically the auditors checking the financial statements and the authenticity of the financial statements, and basically confirming via a report saying the what the financial statements are sort of showcasing is fair and true, and it has all been done methodically. Now, if you are not strong with your knowledge around financial accounting, or your knowledge around international accounting auditing standards, then that sort of sets you back a little bit in terms of performing and in terms of how you're able to understand, apply the knowledge to the relevant scenario. So I would suggest going through your accounting knowledge is quite key, especially when it comes to things like materiality, whether it's things like assessing risk, etc., or even looking at cash flows and things like that on your audit side, or inventories, your accounts payable. These are quite crucial for you to be able to understand what has gone wrong and what is right in terms of audit processes and in terms of doing your substantive testing, etc. Lack of practical knowledge and understanding is another area that the examiner has said where students usually find themselves challenged, and it's quite natural because the job of an auditor is a very specific job, and it's of a very sort of it holds a certain level of expertise. So if you're in a position where you've not had the practical experience of an auditor, it becomes slightly challenging for students. And then I won't say it's impossible, but you can't basically see certain things through the lens of an actual auditor. So always there's always a plus in having that kind of practical experience, like I said, but there's nothing to discourage you from sitting this exam without any practical knowledge, as long as you really view every concept and you start recognizing, and you become more and more involved with how real life audit works. You've got to understand the different processes, you've got to understand the different stages, and once you start understanding what happens within each of these stages, then you can really start thinking like an auditor. So get your basic principles correct, get your knowledge correct, use the application part of your knowledge quite properly when you're writing your exams. That very naturally leads us to the third point, where again the examiner has identified that students generally are not good with applying the knowledge to the scenario. So like, for example, if you're asked to put substantive tests, recognize and suggest some substantive testing, students end up jotting down a pre-learned list of substantive tests that they know, rather than applying to the scenario and using a particular example of the scenario given, and then recognizing, well, in this case, this test is recommended, this test of control is recommended, this test of control is recommended. So it's all about being hands-on and really being able to understand. And this lack of understanding, lack of practical knowledge, or lack of being able to relate what you read in theory to real life scenario has an effect where you don't necessarily apply the knowledge to the scenario effectively. So what I would recommend in this case is try and understand things from a practical perspective, try and challenge things in your head. Why is this happening? Why this? When you keep asking the question why, you will yourself start answering a lot of those questions. So that will help you apply. And again, question practice is something that will really help you apply, the knowledge to a particular scenario. So practice as many questions as you possibly can. The next comment that the examiner makes is, students generally have an unfamiliarity with word processing skills and tools. So try and, brush up your computer-based skills, especially your skills around word processing, and you being able to use word processing tools, because this is what you will be using in order to, sort of type your exam or construct your answers in an exam. If you are familiar with it, if you are hands-on with those skills, you will end up saving a lot of time. Your presentation will look a lot better. So try and start using these kind of things. We have a dedicated document again on our ACCA student support, study support resources section that can take you through various different there is basically a guide on word processing tools. There's a guide on spreadsheet tools. It'll give you all the shortcuts that you can use. It'll give you all the information. I would recommend, if you're somebody who really struggles with your CBE skills, then a good sort of suggestion would again be for you to go in and look at those guides, look at practice your typing skills, practice your word processing unit skills, and try and brush up those skills so you can become more and more efficient with your time management, as well as completing your exams efficiently. Next point obviously very well sits with what I've just said, managing your time. Examiners have again noticed, and I've mentioned earlier, that students often tend to leave a lot of questions, or tend to sort of, the examiners feel, or the markers feel, when students have attempted certain questions, that they've ended up spending a lot of time on one part of a question, and then because of the crunch of timing, they've not been able to sort of justify or answer certain other parts of the question, or another question completely with effect. So ideally, being able to manage your time is quite crucial, and especially for your audit and assurance exam, because it's all wordy, it's all quite, you've got to type a lot, you've got to be able to explain certain things. So it's very important for you to be able to sort of manage your time and balance your time quite well in your audit and assurance exam. I'm just going to pause for a second and need a sip of water. Right. Moving on, let's look at section A, and basically a very few sort of comments. Again, like I said, I've kept it very generic. What the examiners do is basically they pick up questions from the exam, and they work through those questions, and they help you identify and analyze. I've not done the question bit here. What I've done is I've read through the different questions, different components of the examiner's report from December last year and March this year, and I've come up with some key sort of common themes that I noticed within the examiner's comments. So one of them is the knowledge of the entire syllabus is essential. Again, basically in your section A, the entire section is comprised of 3 questions referred to as OT cases. Each question basically contains a single scenario against which you obviously have 5 different OT questions. The OT questions are examinable from various parts of the syllabus, and therefore it becomes essentially important for you to be able to have that kind of knowledge from across the syllabus. So like I said, and I've been consistently saying this throughout the session, you cannot cherry pick, you cannot spot topics that are going to be examined. With the objective test questions, there is a lot of flexibility to the examiner. Basically, there's a lot of choices that the examiner can put in. So ideally, focus on entire syllabus and have your knowledge on the entire syllabus updated. Students tend to spend a lot more time than required on questions. Now, again, in your section A, you've got to remember that every question, so every objective test question, is basically only worth 2 marks each. For a 2-mark question, you've only got typically 3 or 3.5 minutes that you can spend. If it's taking you any longer than that, then I would recommend that leave that question, flag it for review later on, come back to it when you've got spare time. So don't end up spending valuable time on questions. Effective time management is quite crucial. It's key for students to be able to complete their exam, because the more time you spend on a question that you're really not sure about, and you're struggling to answer, you are giving yourself less time to spend on questions that you've got good information on, you've got full knowledge on, and that's how you start producing your valuable marks as well as your valuable time. So it's all about the strategy. It's all about getting your right strategy in. Time management is one of the very crucial parts of that strategy. Again, like I said previously, your knowledge of international standards of auditing is quite crucial, and accounting standards has to be, you know, relevant and critical. If you're not confident with your accounting standards, how are you going to be able to think like an auditor? How are you going to be able to, you know, sort of validate that financial statements, or, you know, certain processes or certain things of an organization are valid and are justified? So having that kind of knowledge and that backdrop is quite important. Students, it is generally observed by the examiner that students tend to sort of have that lack in knowledge during, you know, section A type questions when they're answering those questions. Again, the importance of reading the question carefully. You know, do not rush with reading the question. Read your question carefully, especially in the audit exam where you've got a case and then you've got 5 questions relating to that case. Again, the strategy here would be to be able to read the questions first and then start reading the scenario, because then you'll know exactly what sort of information you need to pick from a scenario that will help you answering those questions. Section B comments are things like, you know, leaving out or missing out some requirements. Again, students tend to be overconfident, tend to overrush. Like I said, you know, you know, requirements with 2 parts. The use of and within your requirement is quite crucial. Sometimes students tend to overlook this. I've myself actually made a couple of these mistakes when I used to be a student. You know, I've just read part of the question. I started answering this question, writing it down, because it was paper-based exams when I was doing them, and then I basically got carried away with it and completely ignored the second part of a question. And you know what, every time you have a part question where, you know, and if it's something like, you know, identify and explain, if you've only focused on identify, and if you've only put down points on identify and completely ignored and forgot explain, tell you what, there was only probably there's a huge chance there was only 25%. If it was a 15-mark question or a requirement, then the explain part would probably be worth 5 marks, and sorry, the identify part would probably be about 5 marks, and the explain part would be the bigger chunk where you had 10 marks. Naturally, what you've ended up doing is you've lost the opportunity to score any marks on the bigger chunk. And how much can you score on a 5-mark question? So it's absolutely important for you as students to be able to really, you know, read the requirements carefully, understand, you know, what the requirements are asking, and be able to answer the question, you know, in proper time. Not answering the requirement correctly also is a huge issue. Now, again, you know, this relates back to identifying, or it relates back to really understanding the verbs in the requirement. You know, for your audit and assurance exam, the verbs that you can basically expect to have is things like explain, describe, analyze, list. I mean, what else can I think of? Yep, and basically be able to understand if the requirement is asking for us, if it's mentioning a certain verb, what is it that you've got to do? And I'll start off with an example. So I've got this pen here, and imagine if the requirement said describe the pen. If it says describe only, then what you've got to basically do is say, well, yeah, it's a pen. It looks gray in color and it's got red lines in between. It's got a cap here. Essentially, what you've done is you've just described the pen. If the requirement is saying explain, then ideally you'd be looking at it, and obviously you'd have to describe it first to be able to explain. So you describe it, you say yes, it's a pen, but then you take it a step forward and you say, well, it is used to write things, or it is used to be writing, you know, it helps with writing things or taking notes down. It's got a cap because it doesn't, so that it helps in not, you know, in the ink not drying up, etc. So when you're explaining, you've got to start adding reasons, and what you've got to think about when you explain is the why factor. You bring in the why why in your head, and you always ask why. So that will help you answer some, you know, some of these explain type questions. If the requirement would have said analyze, then you go, well, this is a pen, It's gray in color, possibly because the gray colors are quite attractive to people and they are a good selling point. It has got a cap because people prefer to have a two-parted pen. It might have been better if it had a push button on the top instead of the cap, so that people would prefer not to lose one part or the other. And this is analysis. So you start, when you're asked to analyze, then you start thinking from both ends, the negatives and the positives, and you start thinking aloud. Basically, analysis is such a good verb. And if you get, your requirement says analyze, it puts you in an open field, and you can start, really thinking aloud. You can explore, why these things are happening. What if it was this way? So with analyze, with your, when you're asked to analyze, along with your why, bringing what if. So, what if this is like this, but what if it was? And that's how you'll be able to analyze. So when you're asked to analyze, you've got to think about, both sides of a coin, basically. So the focus on your verbs is quite essential. You need to understand, what the examiner is trying to ask you. You need to have the emphasis on exactly what the verbs are. The third most important comment on section B type questions is knowledge dump and lack of application. And this is something which is so common, students make this mistake repeatedly. Now, the examiner does not want to know, or the marker does not want to know how much knowledge you have of different concepts or that particular concept. So you stop knowledge dumping. You don't need to start dumping everything that you know about that particular subject. So for example, if, let's say, if your internal controls were very strong, or if you had a question on, on a retail business, and you had a question on stock take, and you knew exactly why stock takes are so important, you don't have to start writing everything down or dumping all of that knowledge. You need to see how much of that knowledge you want, or how much of that knowledge will really help the scenario, because section B type questions are always based on a scenario. So you'll be given a certain scenario. So in the context of maybe doing a stock take, you're probably given a question saying, you go into Ralph Lauren and you've got to do a stock take at Ralph Lauren. So basically you need to understand, there's going to be several things mentioned in the scenario. It might probably say, well, you do a stock count and you find that a certain type of t-shirt or products XYZ, 5 of them were missing compared to the ledgers or the stock count, etc., and all of that. That's when you need to start analyzing. That's when you need to start, sort of coming up with recommendations, with solutions. Well, if a certain amount of t-shirts are missing, then this could be the reason. Probably, they're probably not counted for. Probably there's theft involved. People have stolen a few t-shirts, etc. So it's not about applying knowledge. It's always about applying that knowledge in relation to the scenario that has been given to you, answering the requirements, answering the questions. And lastly, being able to, so analysis to identify relevant points to answer questions are generally weak. Again, very much similar to what I've mentioned just now. I mean, students tend to sort of perform quite poorly when they've got scenarios, and they've got to be able to analyze, and they've got to be able to spend time in planning their answers, in being able to detail their answers, and that's what students need to ideally spend time on. And how can you perfect this? How can you get this? How can you identify which points are relevant to the requirement and which are not? That can only happen through question practice. So you try and practice as many questions as you possibly can. If you've got the practical knowledge of auditing, then definitely it helps, because you'll be able to clearly see what points are quite relevant to a certain scenario and how you can use them in the requirement. So it's important for you to be able to practice as many questions as you can, so your answer planning is perfect, and you end up writing more effective and more answers that will basically be more constructive. Your narratives will give you that quality of marks that you sort of deserve to get in the exam. Now, having looked at the examiner's comment, it's about time that we look at what are the ideal steps for success, and what success looks like, and how can you basically ensure that you're passing your exams effectively, and you're doing everything that you possibly can in order to, perform better on your exam. So these are a few things that will really help you. And if you as a student focus on some of these tips and some of these comments, they will really help you enhance your performance, especially if you're one of those students that have previously sat the audit and assurance exam, and and you've probably not been successful, or you've got your marks in the range of 40s, or things like that. Then these tips will really help you get the additional 5, 6, 8 marks that you possibly can. So let's look at a couple of areas, and how you could basically identify getting each mark. So professional ethics, like I said, professional ethics is a key topic on your audit exams. Lovely questions with lots of marks available. Typically, you would be asked to identify and explain ethical threats from a given scenario. For each threat, explain how you might be able to reduce it to an acceptable level. When you've got questions around professional ethics, or corporate governance, etc., in your audit and assurance exam, very crucial. Ideally, the mark split is you get a half mark for identifying. Again, focus on the requirement here. This is actually an exam requirement that I put here. So there's identify, and then there's explain. So half a mark for identifying, half a mark for explain, and then 1 mark for giving a recommendation on how you can reduce the potential threat to an acceptable level. Very easy set of marks. You can score high marks, even if you've just, if it's something that is challenging, which I don't think you will be find this topic challenging, but if you do, still at least you can get the half marks by identifying. If it's a 10-mark requirement, don't do any more than 5, don't identify any more than 5 threads. So just focus on 5. The 5 will give you the split. So identifying will give you that half mark, explain will give you the half mark of 5 points, and then recommendations will give you that 1 mark each. You must always present your answer in a column format, ideally in a tabular format. So within the word, and the beauty of being able to do this exam on a word processing unit is you can add tables, you can add sections, etc., and you can very neatly, against every thread, have a recommendation, threat recommendation, tick, 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 easy marks for you. Audit risk, again, tends to be a very highly examinable topic. Students tend to get mixed with this question sometimes. Typically these questions, these are all questions that get asked on your section B, and they include things like, again, identify and explain the audit risks from the scenario. For each risk, explain the auditor's response. Pretty much the same strategy, half a mark for identify, half a mark for explain, and then 1 mark for your auditor response. Again, being able to present it in a column format, in a table on your word processing answer sheet, is going to be absolute crucial in supporting you with being able to get maximum mark. Half a mark for identifying, half a mark for explain. Don't forget the pen example when it comes to work. Identify means just identify. You don't need to start jotting things down about it. When you come to explain, think about why. So why, and then start explaining. Again, don't write a book on when you start explaining a certain concept. It has to be very, very specific, to the point. Don't sort of start mulling over it. So keep it specific, to the point, move to the next one, and that's how you'll be able to manage your time. Internal control, again, I just spoke to you about it. A very sort of, this is a favorite sort of area for the examiner, and generally exams tend to have a question on internal controls. Again, within the section B of the question, typically, again, identify and explain deficiencies from a scenario. So internal control questions will always be around identifying or recommending different sort of test of controls. So recommend a control for each of the above. You identify any deficiencies. So there could be different industries. You can have scenarios on a restaurant business. You can have scenarios on a on a corporate function. You can have scenarios relating to retail businesses. There's a whole vast array. The best way to tackle internal control questions is to be able to understand that business, to be able to understand the nature of the business, to be able to understand the environment in which the business operates. So if it's something like a bank, then obviously the internal controls for a bank will be a lot more different. So there'll be security, there'll be accesses, staff will have to have a certain protocol, security, etc. Your scenario will obviously tell you deficiencies, and there'll always be more deficiencies than you can list. Don't sort of get carried away with that. You might find 10, 14, 15 deficiencies in a given scenario, but if it's a 10-mark question, then you need to understand that you've only got to explain 5, or at the most maximum 7 deficiencies. Don't keep writing more and more, because it's not going to get you any more marks. You will end up losing the valuable time. So identify the deficiency, explain the deficiency a little bit, and then recommend a control for that deficiency. And then 1 mark for, you can further, if it's a bigger question, they'll ask you to recommend test of controls that auditors would generally perform to see how, or to test the effectiveness of that internal control. So you recommend a test of control. So if you're recommending a test of control, there'll be an additional mark for it. So look at what the overall mark of the requirement is. Look at how many different things the requirement has asked for, and on the basis of that, focus on a few deficiencies or on the scenario. So yeah, like I said, there'll always be more deficiencies in a scenario, but don't try to cover them all. It's not going to get you any more marks than you would get by just listing 5 or 7 main ones or big ones that you think you can reason out. Audit procedures is another very important topic. It's a key syllabus area, and students generally tend to underperform on the audit procedure side also. I would highly recommend that you pay some attention, or you practice. The only key to mastering questions on audit procedures is practicing. If you don't have the relevant knowledge as an auditor, you don't have the practical knowledge, then the only way you can start thinking like an auditor is by solving as many questions that you possibly can on audit procedures. So the strategy is understand what happens within the audit process, and when you're describing the audit procedures, you start practicing questions. The more questions you practice, the better you'll start getting at with auditing and audit procedures. This is if you've got that lack of practical experience. So you should not provide a pre-learned list of generic procedures. What students generally tend to do is they rote learn all the different audit procedures, and they, for example, if they've got a question relating to banking, or if they've got a question relating to a coffee shop basically, and there is an audit happening in the coffee shop, you cannot say that one of the procedure would be to go and test at walls, because that's relevant to the banking the banking function. So ideally you should stick to the scenario, and what you recommend in terms of audit procedures should be very much tailored to your your scenario, rather than just a dump of all the different audit procedures you have. It needs to be specific to the scenario. So the commonly used verb here is describe the audit procedures. And remember what I said about describe. When you're describing, remember the pen here, you describe and then you ask why. So you look at things like, when you're facing audit procedures questions, you look at things like, what are you testing? So basically, if it's a procedure and if it's asking you to test something, what are you testing? So what is the assertion behind it? How are you going to be doing the procedure? So what will you need to do in order to be carrying, conducting the procedure, and why do you think this procedure is important? Why do you think you need to do a certain thing or a certain test in order to be conducting that procedure? So to give you an example, to confirm the existence of non-current assets at the year end, and look at the emphasis on the existence, on the words like existence, non-current assets, year end. Select a sample of such assets. So this is basically one recommendation that an auditor would be giving. So select a sample of such assets from non-current assets register, and physically, again, physically is important, because this is signifying how. So what needs to be done was covered in the first part. The second part is about how. So you physically verify the assets that exist by auditor's inspection. So and then you follow it up with a reason why you've done this. So ideally it should be a summary of 3 things: what you're doing, how you're doing, and why you're doing it. So audit procedure questions are all about being relevant to the scenario and being able to explain why a certain procedure is needed in a certain circumstance. Just conscious of time here, running through a few things. Audit reports, again, very sort of important area. generally asked questions. Students find it slightly challenging, mostly because of their lack of audit experience. Again, the key here for questions or tackling questions around audit reports is being able to practice the variety or practice as many possible questions that you can. Possible requirements will include things like describe the different elements of an auditor report. So like I said earlier, you won't be asked to do to write a complete auditor's report. You might be given extracts from a different audit report, so things like determine the most appropriate type of audit opinion in a given scenario, often through an explanation of why certain opinion is appropriate. Understand the issues that may arise during the course of an audit that could require an emphasis of matter or other matter paragraphs to be included in an audit report. Identify the key audit matters that are required to be disclosed in an audit report. So these are the kind of things that you might be expected to answer. Instead of writing the type or writing an entire audit report, these are some of the key things that you can expect to see in a question that comes around audit reports. Now, very quickly, what you must do in order to, what is the mantra of success with your audit and assurance exam? I've said this many times: avoid cherry picking. Syllabus has to be gone through completely. You can't choose and pick topics, especially for Section A type questions. Enhance your knowledge around computer-based exams as well as word processing skills. Use the audit terminology. Now, this is very, very important point, and I'd like to spend some time here, telling you all how important it is to be able to answer or use the correct audit terminology. So things like skepticism, professional judgment, due care, these are all your key audit words. You almost should end up having a dictionary, like a sort of dictionary for all the different terminologies and the words that you need. Your answers should display, or the words that you use in your answer should sort of convey the audit lingo, like we call it. So it's quite crucial. Again, this can only come by practicing as many questions as you possibly can. Develop your skills in effective narrative answers. So try and develop your skills. Don't dwell over things. Don't sort of write things endlessly. You don't have to write a book on auditing. If you're confident around certain areas, there is a tendency we get intimidated to keep writing or typing, but it's not going to get you any more marks. Attempt all answers and think about the layout. Planning is very important. Layout is very important. You've got the luxury now of using a sophisticated platform to answer your questions. Editing your answers becomes very easy. When you're in a planning stage, jot down a few bullet points. When you come back to answering that question, you start sort of building on it. Read the requirements carefully. Identify the verbs. I've already stressed the importance of this. Be specific to the scenario. I've said this time and again during the entire session. And always take note of the year-end balances. Calculate materiality. This is quite important for your, and again relates back to my comments previously around the knowledge of accounting standards, the knowledge of financial accounting. It's very important. If your fundamental around financial accounting is weak, how can you expect to be or perform the role of an auditor? Essentially what you're doing in your audit exam is, in your head, assuming that you are an auditor and you are working through scenarios with the assumption that you are an auditor in an organization, and these are the things you would do in a in a given capacity, etc. So bear in mind all these things. Summing it up very quickly, ensure you go through the examiner's comments. Very important. Understand what the examiners are trying to tell you, and incorporate those things in your practice stages as early as possible. Make use of the study support resources. We've told you there's so many good resources on ACCA's website. Please go on to the ACCA's website. Under the students tab, you've got your study support resource section. Select the ACCA qualification, select the exam that you're studying for. You will have a list of resources to your hand. Some of those that are specifically that you should be using are examiner's comments, guidance from the examining team for practicing your constructive response workspace, as well as the CB practice platform. Absolute crucial absolute crucial resources that you need to use. And then practice as much as you can. If you don't have that relevant practical experience, then practicing many exam type questions will help you understand the mind of an auditor, the mindset and what is involved in the profession, etc. So with that, I would now like to invite you all for an opportunity to ask any particular questions that you have. And I'm just trying to open up the questions tab here to see if there are I can see there are a couple of questions that are coming in. So one of them is from Arusa. Kindly please email this recording as I've missed the introduction part of the webinar. Yes, Arusa, so do not worry, we are recording this session and these will be emailed to all the relevant students, as well as we will be putting them up on our social media channels for anybody that has, not been able to attend this live or miss the opportunity. There's always a chance to catch up on it offline as well. How to improve accounting knowledge, any fundamental paper to refer to? So a question, good question by Tasnuva Martin. So Tasnuva, thanks for the question. Well, basically your accounting knowledge should be coming in from the predecessing papers. So right from the start, which is your financial accounting, moving up to your financial reporting, you've got to be able to understand, and those exams, basically the knowledge from those exams give you that edge and that information. If for any reason you've been exempted from these exams, then again, firstly, your exemption would have been given on the basis that you have a certain qualification that has, covered up that syllabus sufficiently. If not, or if you've had a huge gap, then I would say always going back and, looking at some of those previous exams, at least the financial accounting exam, for you to be able to brush up your accounting knowledge and skills. There's another question come up from Hussein, who says, is poor English grammar important, and can it reduce marks? So Hussein, I would not say that it reduces marks, but what happens if you don't have, if English is not your first language, or if you find it challenging to construct, then you might have to put in a lot more effort to be able to explain a certain point. So for somebody who's more hands-on with English as a language, maybe you might be able to explain one thing in 4 or 5 words at most. For a person who's not hands-on with English as a language, they'd probably take 3 or 4 or 5 different sentences to be able to explain the same thing. That is not a deterrent, but yes, I mean, slight disadvantage. In order to support somebody with their English language, again, we have a fantastic resource on our website. It's also covered within our virtual learning center, which is, again, the ACCA's very newly developed resource, and it's got the BPP English language course, where the proficiency and the language requirement is split as per the paper. So if you were doing the first 3 ACCA exams, what are the kind of, what is the requirement, what is the proficiency in English that you should have? So I would definitely recommend that you go in and you try and explore that resource for anybody that it finds themselves challenged with English. But it's not a deterrent. We've done this exam. I come from a country where English was not my first language as well, but it's all about practicing. It's all about reading as much as you possibly can and understanding, and we always tend to find a way to communicate our message to the opposite person. Some of us might do it in a more eloquent and a more efficient way. Some of us might take slightly longer to explain a point. Okay, there's a question from Sharon, who says, ideally, how many examiners reports do you recommend to read before the exam? So Sharon, I mean, there is no stipulated number of examiners report, but what I would personally recommend is definitely read the last examiner report, the last 1 or 2 examiners report, as well as if you're, for example, doing the September exam, then at least read the examiner report for September 2019, the one year before. So you'll be able to understand. Again, same thing with examiners' articles. Examiners basically tend to drop in hints when they write their articles. So when you're referring to examiner's article, try and read articles that are possibly published a year ago, because that's when the examiners start dropping hints that we might possibly examine a certain topic or a certain relevant market specific question. Wow, lots of questions coming up. I'm conscious of time here, but if you guys are okay, sort of hanging on, I am okay to sort of hang on and answer as many questions I possibly can. Another question coming up: why is it that we don't crack the exam and lose at 45 to 47? Rija, okay, excellent, good question, Rija. If you've lost, if you've been unsuccessful, for any students that have been unsuccessful, or students that are on a marginal fail, where we say anything between 45 to 49 is a marginal fail. So any students that are failing marginally, I feel it's not knowledge gap. It's basically your exam technique that's a problem. So, ideally, maybe you're not managing your time correctly. Maybe your exam nervousness is kicking in when you try and go into your exam. Your confidence level matters a lot. So if you've got 45 to 47 or 48, 49, then you've got the knowledge. It just tells that your exam strategy is wrong, and you need to start working on your exam strategy. So that could be via exam practice, question practice, solving mock exams, basically doing mock exams under time condition, so to pretend as if you are sitting in an actual exam, isolate yourself in a quiet place, do a proper full-fledged exam, save your answers, give it to an expert tutor to mark it, give you feedback, and then see how it turns up. You will definitely cross that bridge and move from that late 40s marks to early 50s, or perhaps even get better marks. But it's definitely your exam technique. I don't think it's your knowledge gap. Yes, knowledge gaps can be there if you're weak with certain, but then it's all about identifying those knowledge gaps. And the only way you can identify again your knowledge gaps is by going back, practicing questions, or referring at examiner's report for the exam sessions that you have sat, to see exactly fundamentally what were the main mistakes that students made. Good question by Farid. How do we improve the audit terminology, and what do we do about it? So audit terminology is quite simple. You come across it in your textbooks, you come across it in your classes when your tutors are lecturing you, you come across it when you're practicing questions. It's all about paying attention to those words. It's all about giving them emphasis. It's all about understanding. When I remember when I was an audit student and I used to sit in my audit class, I used to actually sit with the dictionary, and when I used to read answers or sample answers, I used to go back thinking, oh, well, it says this. What is the meaning of skepticism? What is skepticism? And I used to look, and I used to literally write down on the side saying, well, skepticism means this. So every time there was a scenario, there was scope for me to be able to use that word, I would use it in an audit exam. So that's quite crucial. The only way you can improve your audit terminology is basically by answering as many exam specific questions as you possibly can. Right. Oops, I've lost track. A few more questions. How far back can we go when it comes to practice papers, since rules and legislations keep changing every year, and so do the answers? So good question by Rona. Rona, I think when it comes to auditing, there's not a huge amount of change that happens every year. Yes, accounting standards get updated, etc., etc. So an ideal practice would be to at least go behind a year, so you can safely go behind a year and practice that many questions. So if you're sitting the exam in September, then you're safe to practice June, March, December, and September last year's up to those questions. So that's fine. Things don't majorly change on the audit syllabus as much as they would change probably on a tax syllabus, or the advanced strategic business reporting exam. There's a question from Omar who says a lot of topics in F8, which is the old terminology, and advanced audit are same. What is the level of toughness of exam expected in audit exam for common topics, and where does the difference lies? Good question, Omar. So basically, the difference between, or the jump from your fundamental exams to your advanced exams is in the testing of knowledge, more so in the application stages. So when you do your audit and assurance exam, you will notice that the knowledge is the application of knowledge is not tested that much in detail. The complexities of the questions are not as rigorous as they would be on your advanced audit and assurance exam. So the concepts still remain the same. The level changes, or the difficulty level changes in terms of being able to apply your knowledge to a relevant scenario. So the questions become slightly difficult at the advanced level. All right. Okay, a couple of questions around the revision phase. What are the things that we should keep in mind in the revision phase? Basically, recap your summary. summarize your key topics, get your knowledge aspect covered fully, and then question practice. So when you're doing your revision, your revision phase, practice questions from your approved content material and get it marked. Basically, just practicing is not enough. Get it referenced. So look at the marks breakdown. Look at get expert comments from tutors, etc., on how you perform. There's a question by Sejal. Do you think it is possible to pass on the first attempt if you have self-studied? Well, why not? Although self-studying is not recommended, and I wouldn't really recommend anybody to study by themselves, because these are professional qualifications exams. But this is something which is very subjective, depends from person to person, and sort of differs from person to person. So if you've self-studied, if you're confident, as long as you've put in enough practice, as long as you're confident, you can still pass. There is no distinction around can you pass an exam or can you not pass an exam. If the only thing that will ensure you pass an exam is your confidence, the knowledge of the subject that you have, and if you want to check or get that knowledge tested, I would say do mock exams, mark it yourself, or get an expert tutor to basically mark it for you, and that's how you'll get feedback, and you'll know basically how prepared you are for an actual exam. Right, the last couple of questions. Audit procedures, for example, when we want to state why, so the reason, we can state 2 or 4 reasons. How many of them should be written? 1 or more to get the full mark. So basically 1 or 2 reasons at most should be fine, Hussein. You don't have to necessarily start dwelling on the reasons as well. You'll always have more reasons on audit procedures. You've got to identify the most relevant one, the one that you think is extremely relevant and will give you that definite 1 mark or 2 marks, or how many ever marks is allocated to it. Ideally, how many weeks should be allocated to the revision before the exam? Again, good question by Rona. Rona, I think typically you should start your revision 6 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks before the actual exam. So you must give yourself at least 2 or 3 weeks of revision, at the bare minimum 2 weeks of revision, where you do or you incorporate. Ideally, you should start incorporating question practice in your learning stages onwards. You should start beginning practicing questions when you're learning. So you've done one topic, you go into the revision kits and you start picking up relevant questions from those revision kits, and then you start answering them. But you should at least allow 2 to 4 weeks for revision. Okay, there's one final question. Should our answers need to be concerned about question, or can we add typical audit, same kind of procedure, or audit risk? My apologies, but if I'm understanding your question correctly, you're trying to ask me, should your answer always be relevant to the scenario or the question, or can you also add typical audit processes or procedures or audit risk? Ideally, your answers need to be relevant. Your answers have to be relevant to the given scenario, and that's when you will score more marks. If you throw in a point which is not relevant to the scenario, it's not going to give you any marks. What you're typically suggesting is a dump of knowledge, which a lot of times students do, and is not highly recommended by the examiners or us. So basically, don't dump knowledge and stick to the scenario. Keep your answers as specific as you possibly can. Right, with that, I would like to sort of highlight a few things. There are no more questions coming in, and I'm also conscious of time. So if you have to reach out to us, here's our email addresses, contact number. You can also follow us on our social channels on Facebook, on Instagram, on LinkedIn, YouTube, as ACCA Middle East, to keep yourself updated, to have the relevant updates. We do a lot of sessions for the benefit of our students, and the more of you attend, these sessions, the better it is. It's encouraging for us also to be able to, carry on doing this. You've got all our resources on accaglobal.com, and we have a local Middle East page as well, which is www.accama.me. This is where we put also, again, all our updates and repository of everything that we do. So do engage with these resources and channels of interaction with us. With that, I would like to bring today's session to a close. Thank you everyone for attending the session, and I wish you all good luck with your oncoming future exams. Take care and keep safe.